Well, good afternoon or good morning, depending upon where you are, everybody. I'm Roddy Gow from the Asia Scotland Institute, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to this very timely webinar looking at the thinking and writings of Adam Smith under the subject of From Copycat to Innovator, the Moral Foundations of Entrepreneurship. Just before we get going, it's to say we are using the Zoom platform as a webinar, which means you can't be seen, the panelists can, and you can't be heard. But if you would use the Q&A or chat functions to write down any questions that you may have, and we will come to those after we've dealt with the body of the discussion here. So we're very lucky indeed to have two extremely relevant panelists looking at Adam Smith's perspective on moral philosophy and exploring the fundamental tenets of his views on ethics, morality, and their influence on economic practices. This is the 300th anniversary of Adam Smith's birth, and so very timely to be doing talks about him. Dr. Eamonn Butler is director of the Adam Smith Institute, which he founded after studying at St. Andrews and then later spending time in the United States, where he worked on pensions and welfare issues for the US House of Representatives and taught philosophy in Hillsdale College, Michigan, before returning to the UK to help found the Adam Smith Institute. Russell Dalgleish, who is a member of the Asia Scotland Institute board, is the founder of Scottish Business Network. I like to describe him as a serial entrepreneur. He has started very many businesses and helped a large number of people develop their own businesses, and so has plenty of experience of working in markets both in the UK, the US, and throughout Asia. And so he will be in conversation with Eamonn as this webinar progresses. The webinar is being recorded and will be shown on YouTube in due course so that you can see it again and that others not able to join us will be able to watch it. So Eamonn, I wonder if I could ask you to share with us your thoughts on Adam Smith and his relevance in today's markets under the title that we have for this webinar. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Rory. Well, I think everybody's familiar with Adam Smith's economic writing. He was, after all, the father of modern economics. He wasn't the first economist, but he was the first to systematize the subject of economics. And he turned economics into something which is recognizably modern today. Just read the first page of The Wealth of Nations, his great economic book, and you discover, he says that, well, the wealth of a nation isn't gold and silver. What it is the productive capacity of its people. And you think, gosh, there we are. In the first paragraph, he's invented the idea of gross domestic product, a gross national product, which is something we still use today. And then in the second paragraph, he says, well, of course, you know, some countries are richer because they've got more people. And then you think, well, that's interesting. He's now talking about GDP per capita. This is another idea. And then he goes on to say, well, you know, and some people aren't working at all because they're older or they're too young or they're ill. And then you think, oh, right, so he's got the idea of productivity here. So just in the first page, he's introduced all of these concepts which are modern, and he introduces the idea of the division of labor, how if individuals and countries specialize, there's a huge gain in productivity, a staggering gain in productivity. So he promotes that, and he promotes trade and markets, and says that interference with markets is damaging to human prosperity, and that actually if you let people do pretty much what they want to do, then there's a spontaneous, or it's like an invisible hand, which will actually benefit the entire community. You don't need to run these things. So you don't need a huge state to run an economy. It pretty well runs itself. So I think people are familiar with all of that. But interestingly, the book that made Adam Smith famous was not The Wealth of Nations. It came a decade and a half earlier. It was The Theory of Moral Sentiments. It was a book about ethics, about moral philosophy. And you think, well, you know, what's an 18th century view of moral philosophy got to do with us today? But I think Adam Smith, when he was writing that book, he had it in the back of his mind that he might do a book on economics. I always say he was really a social psychologist, not an economist, not a philosopher. Social psychology. He was interested in the whole of the human mind, and part of that is economics, part of it is morality. So he'd already got these things in the back of his mind. And I think that many of the things that he says about moral life are important to business life as well. So I'd be fascinated to hear Russell's take on these things. But for example, he talks about the importance of virtues. And the virtues to him are prudence, which means looking at your own long-term interests, not trying to make a quick buck, but trying to build up a reputation so that people will trust you and do business with you. That seems to me quite important for business. Justice, treating people fairly and equally and not discriminating against them. Again, I think in business that's extremely important. You've got to treat your customers individuals, not as if they're members of groups that you either like or don't like. And the same is true of your workers and your suppliers. Beneficence, he talks about just doing good if you can, if it's not going to inconvenience you. And he talks about self-command as another virtue. And again, I think that's absolutely crucial in business. I mean, if you're going to set up a business and run it effectively, you've got to be in charge of your own mind and your own psychology, and you can't let it waver. So I think all of those things are important to business. And I think that also Adam Smith's view that business is not an immoral activity. There's so many people these days think that, oh, well, you people are only in it for profit, and that's not moral. But in fact, Adam Smith knew that business is a long-term relationship between people, and that you need to develop those relationships. And you know that it's a moral activity because if your customers carry on coming back to you, you know that you're supplying something that they want and need, and they know that you're not trying to cheat them. So I think all of these things are very important. And I was in Korea recently, just a couple of months ago, and it's very interesting to see that economy. And it is trying to move from being a catch-up copycat economy, where you look at what is happening in developed countries and you just try to do more of it. So you make cars and you make washing machines and things like that, but you do it better and cheaper. They're trying to move from that to being a more sort of innovative entrepreneurial economy, so that they're actually leading business rather than following it. And it seems to me that Adam Smith's views are incredibly relevant to that, because entrepreneurial businesses, well, they're new, they tend to be smaller, they tend to depend very much more on people rather than machines and plant and equipment. So you've got to know how to treat people. You've got to understand human psychology. So I think all of these things that we find in Adam Smith are actually quite important to business, and they're particularly important to entrepreneurial business, and that I think is why it's so very interesting for Asian economies that are really trying to turn themselves into entrepreneurial, inventive, human-based economies.
I know that he wrote about China. What would he make of the US-China challenges at the moment?
Well, of course, he was very much in favor of free trade, but he did understand that countries do use trade as a political weapon as well, and so he errs on the side of free trade and keep trade open, because he thinks that promotes peace and certainly promotes value to both sides. But at the same time, he does understand that sometimes you have to put your foot down and say, no, we're not playing ball on this one, because you're cheating, you're protecting your own industry, you're subsidizing your own industry, or whatever. But he says, do be conscious that might then simply lead to a riposte, a retaliation, and then you're down a slippery slope, and eventually you end up not trading with each other at all. So I think he'd be very alarmed at the current situation.
And what would his view be on global supply chains?
Well, it's very hard to put a 21st century idea into the mind of an 18th century person. But I think that he was he certainly believed that trade should be as wide as possible, and he writes about opening up the Straits of Magellan and opening up the Cape of Good Hope, and how those things transformed the trade, even just before his lifetime. And so I think he would want to keep trade links open as all around the planet as far as possible. And of course, in his famous example of he says, how much labor has gone in, how many people have been involved in producing the ordinary woolen coat of an ordinary worker? And he said thousands. That there are the wool has to be raised, and the wool has to be cut, and the wool has to be dyed, and that means you've got to take dye in often from foreign countries, and introduce it and boil it up and soak your wool in it, and then you've got to transport all the equipment, and somebody's got to make the shears that you shear the sheep with. So these are enormously complex supply chains, and he did understand that very fully, and he sort of reveled in the wonderful complexity of it, how these things all come together through the price system, because people get paid for doing these things. So it all works together, and it produces this simple product, but thousands of people are involved in it. So I think he would definitely want to keep supply chains as open as possible.
Good. David, thanks. That's very interesting. So, Russell, you've had a chance to think about some of Eamonn's comments. Over to you.
Thank you so much. I'm really intrigued by your mention of Korea. So I was in Seoul last year, and it was my first visit to Korea in 18 years. And I was stunned by the change in the city in that time. I think 18 years ago, my memory is of businesses run by men, everyone in suits and ties, very conformist, very structured. And when I was there, as I'm sure you saw it when you were there, it was like California. There's people in ripped jeans running companies. Astonishing change. And I wonder what you feel that opportunity is for the UK, etc., in Asia, with the fact that this dynamism is changing in these countries, and it's changing in a structure that we, as devotees of Adam Smith, would understand.
Well, I'm not sure I quite share your view of Korea. I think that yes, you're right. Yes, there is a lot more dynamism and individualism around than there were. And yes, absolutely, the country has changed incredibly over the last, well, I've been going on and off for 25 years and more, and Seoul, for example, is just a completely different city. It's just completely different, and there's building going on everywhere, and all the rest of it. But at the same time, it's very difficult to break a sort of cultural way of doing things. So yes, you're right. I mean, I went to events, and there were many more women, for example, than you would see 5 years ago, even 10 years ago, and that must be good. But at the same time, there is still a rather differential culture, and it's still a rather hierarchical culture. I think it's very difficult to break these things, really. I think what breaks it is business. It's doing business and realizing you should be employing people because they're good at their job, not because they're male or female, or they're old or young, or whatever. So eventually it does break down, but I think it can take quite a long time to do so.
You're really reminding me of my trip, because I would, of course, be the oldest person at every meeting. And it was quite definitely, everyone was very deferential to me. And I also saw that example of Korean entrepreneurial companies and other Asian countries coming to the UK and really struggling with that business culture here. That the fact that the culture in somewhere like Korea is conformist, and there are particular ways. And this idea about, you know, coming to the UK and just reaching out to someone on LinkedIn and going have a meeting with them, that was something very different. But these are things that for 300 years in the West, that's been the way we've done business. We have to find new people to do business with. And do you think that there's a direct link back from where we are today to what Adam Smith wrote about 300 years ago that's actually defining our society today in terms of business?
Golly, that's an interesting one. I think you are right. I mean, Adam Smith himself, although he was an academic, he mixed with all these people and all these business people. And you get the impression that this was a very easy society in the 18th century, that people of different professions, different walks of life, stations of life, that they did meet together. And of course, I think, you know, recently, certainly in the UK and in the United States and Canada and so on, we see that writ large, because young people, you know, people in their teens are starting businesses and making themselves $1 million and $10 million and $100 million. And you think, gosh, right, I mean, anybody can do this. And I think that is actually an extremely important thing, that anybody can do that. And it's vital, I think, that we keep opportunities open, that anybody from whatever walk of life they come from and whatever age they might be, that they can start a business and make themselves money. And the important thing is not to be envious of that, but to rejoice in it. Yeah. That's actually very difficult for older people. When you see younger folk driving around in their sports cars, you think, oh, what have they done to earn that? Well, you know, presumably they've satisfied lots of customers.
Thank you for that. And you talked about the book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And I'm quite intrigued by our relationship today as a society with the business and commerce community. And there seems to be an antagonism developing. But whenever we look at examples, it tends to be that the business community the greed has taken over. And these sentiments such as prudence, trust, justice have been set aside in order to accumulate wealth. Whereas in Scotland, for example, we have a burgeoning social enterprise culture where people are creating companies not to generate commercial value, but to generate social change. And I wondered how that fitted in with some of the thinking from Adam Smith.
Yes, I had a friend at University of St Andrews who did precisely that, set up a social enterprise very successfully. I certainly don't think that Adam Smith would be against any of that. I mean, he was, one of the virtues that he cites is beneficence, that you should do good. He's not saying you should sacrifice yourself to other people, but he's saying that if you've got the opportunity, you should do what you think is going to be beneficial for other people. So that's just fine. I think he was. People these days think of Adam Smith as, oh, he's the arch capitalist. Oh, he was a defender of capitalism, red in tooth and claw, and greed and competition and all of these things. No, that's not true at all, because he famously writes of people of the same trade never get together, even for merriment or diversion, but the conversation turns to a conspiracy against the public. In other words, when business people get together, they start fixing prices and doing things like that. He then goes on to say, that actually it's state regulation that tends to bring them together like that, so that they've got to meet together and discuss these regulations and how they're enforced and all the rest of it. So he thinks the state is the problem, but he's no apologist for business people. In fact, he's extremely critical of business people, and he says when you look at demands for new regulations, they usually come from business people. They usually come from established businesses. And they're designed basically to keep out the competition and keep the trade to themselves. So he says we should be very suspicious, is his word, of calls for regulation that come from the business community. So he realizes that business people will try to hog the market if they possibly can. But he also realizes that with good institutions, you can push business in beneficial directions rather than in harmful directions. And I think this is really our challenge today, that too often I think business people are even more crony with the politicians than they were in Adam Smith's lifetime, and that the politicians have far more power now. So it's worth having a big department that will sidle up to politicians and take them out to lunch and dinner and try to get them to see your point of view, and indeed to promote regulations that will benefit your business. That's why the lobbying industry is so large. But the problem really is, as Adam Smith recognized, the overlarge state. That is the problem. That when you've got a government that's very big and very powerful and lots of money at its disposal, it's not surprising that people are going to throw themselves at it.
And it's quite interesting as well, because as someone who works with entrepreneurs, what I see is the more early stage entrepreneurs are locked out of that opportunity, because it's the large multinationals who can have the staff to assume those roles that I'm sure they wouldn't call it lobbying, but they're in their account managing these government departments.
Yes, yeah. Oh, I've seen it so often. I mean, go to meetings in the House of Commons, and you've got business people and you've got members of Parliament, and the business people are saying, "Oh, Minister, these regulations are working really well, but they'd be so much better if we just tweak this one." And tweak that and we'll have all the business, and all these entrepreneurs will never get through the front door. So I think it is vital that we're aware of that, and that politicians are aware of that, and that they actually protect themselves against that and don't fall for it. Again, if we're looking at Eastern economies, the cronyism there can be quite large in many places, even more so than we have in places like the United Kingdom. And so that is something which has to be fought and resisted, so that individuals with new ideas can come forward.
Eamonn, I've noticed how visitors from Asia beat a path to Adam Smith's grave in the Canongate Kirkyard. And obviously in that part of the world, he is held, it seems, in very high esteem. But to what extent, going back to some of the things that Russell mentioned, to what extent are his ideas being implemented in some of the places like Vietnam and Singapore?
I think that much of the development in those sorts of places, and even in China and so on, has actually come by accident. I don't think it was necessarily planned. I think it was just individuals doing their own thing and finding space to do their own thing. Upheaval in Vietnam, for example, it left an opportunity for people with new ideas and energetic people to come forward and develop new businesses. And now it's a very active place. Even in Cambodia, I was in Cambodia a couple of years ago, and it's very much of a communist-run, communist-led economy, country. But at the same time, if you don't get the wrong side of the politicians, you actually have, there's actually an amazing amount of entrepreneurship around. And I think that's always been true. I remember when Eastern Europe opened up to the world, we saw huge numbers of individuals just setting up little businesses, or they'd already set up little businesses that were overlooked by the socialist governments. And they were doing their own thing. And this sort of entrepreneurship, Adam Smith called it the drive to better your condition, and better the condition of your family and your friends. That is fundamental in human beings. And all you've got to do is just stand out of the way and let that flourish. I'm always reminded of the Greek philosopher Diogenes, who lived in a barrel. and eschewed all worldly wealth and so on. And he was visited by Alexander the Great, who conquered the East at the age of 32. And Alexander said to him, you know, Diogenes, great Diogenes, what can I, Alexander, with all my wealth and armies, what can I do for you? And Diogenes said, just stand out of the sunlight. And I think, you know, Adam Smith understood that governments have to stand out of the sunlight and let entrepreneurship grow and bloom.
That is such a brilliant line. I love that. If I could, as someone who has spent so much time studying Adam Smith, can I ask you this question? There are very few authors born 300 years ago whose work is still held in regard today, particularly when these are not easy books to read. They require an effort to read. Can you sort of indicate as to why? Why has Adam Smith remained popular?
I think he remains popular really through his economic ideas. I'm not sure that people. I mean, I think that the Theory of Moral Sentiments, his book on ethics, is a better book.
Yeah.
But it is very difficult to read, and it's full of references to 18th century debates and so on and so on. The Wealth of Nations, yes, it's still written in 18th century, a flowery 18th century style. Some of it is actually quite funny. He has a dry wit, which does come through, and it's just full of facts. It's just over full of facts. I mean, it's just 1,000,001 facts. I don't know how many. But he uses those to draw out lessons about entrepreneurship and about the role of the government and all these other things and the invisible hand, the spontaneous order, as we would call it today. So I think that's really the reason why he's still read and still respected. I keep telling people, look, don't read The Wealth of Nations and don't read Theory of Moral Sentiments. What you should do is you should read my condensed version, which is free online.
That's what I did.
Well, there you are.
I have one final question before Roddy comes back in again. So I, in addition to being on the board at Asia Scotland Institute, I chair Scottish Business Network, which is our business diaspora. And I wonder, in your travels around the world, is there recognition of Adam Smith as being Scottish? And is that important?
Ooh, well, I think he is recognised as being Scottish, yes. Is it important? Well, I see what you mean. I think, yes, to some extent it is important because I think the Scots, rather like the Dutch, have always been known as a great trading nation.
Yeah.
And of course, there was trade with America, tobacco and sugar and things like that, much of which was loaded in Glasgow. And these were important industries in the 18th century. So I think people are aware that the Scots are. I mean, cynics say that, well, you know, Scotland is such a terrible place that you have to get out of it, so you have to explore the rest of the world and trade with them. But at the same time, I don't know what it is about Scotland, but it has always been, I mean, partly because it's a seafaring nation, very large coast and all the rest of it. So perhaps, you know, it's more inclined to trade than other places. But yes, I think that's the Scottish propensity to trade, I think, is very important, and that's one of the reasons why Adam Smith is important, talking about the need to keep trade open and free.
Yeah, and I believe that we as Scotland should try to make much more, or to recognise that fact that Adam Smith, who's recognised globally, and we should tie that to part of Scotland, but maybe another discussion.
Well, yeah, he's a great brand, like, you know, Tottenham and Scotty Dogs, but better than that.
Russell, thanks. Eamonn, I think you made a very good point too, comparing the Scots to the Dutch as trading nations. We've been talking about Asia, but Adam Smith and his thinking in the United States, which you know very well, as I said when I introduced you at the start of this, in the States, people criticize the power of big corporations to influence everything, really, and particularly politics. And there is this concept of massive donations to political figures to, to back their campaigns. What do you think of that? And what would Adam Smith have thought of that? Has his idea been somewhat corrupted in that respect?
I don't know. I think that people who throw money at politicians are wasting their money, quite honestly. There's very little evidence, if any, and certainly none that I know of, that political donations make the slightest difference to electoral outcomes.
Yeah.
So why bother? I think that the reason that people bother is, and you are right, that it is a large business can throw money at a politician. It won't make any difference to the outcome, but if they do happen to be elected, then they will remember that. And so when the chief executive phones up and says, "Oh, can I have lunch with the congressman? There's something very urgent I want to talk to him or her about," then yeah, the Congress, the representative says, "Yes, absolutely, of course, anything you like." So I think it is a way of getting your foot in the door of politicians, and so that's not good. And I think that Adam Smith would certainly not welcome that. I think he would be quite horrified that the way that has turned out in the United States, where lobbying is a really, really, really big industry. I mean, I saw it myself in Washington all those years ago, and I don't think I ever bought lunch or I was just a junior researcher in an office, and I don't think I bought lunch or dinner in a whole year, because there were lots of free events that you could go to paid for by businesses. And that's a sign that something is unhealthy there, that there is too much interplay between the politicians and the business people. The business people should stick to their own knitting, and the politicians should stick to what they do. But in fact, we're doing almost the opposite. That politicians are trying to make businesses into, if you like, civic institutions by saying, well, they've got to have all this certain responsibilities and so on that they've got to undertake, and they've got to promote local activities and community affairs and all the rest of it. That's not what a business is for. A business is there to make money for its shareholders, and it does that by producing really good services and goods that customers keep coming back because they're so good. So that's the most useful thing that a business can do for society. So forget all this social responsibility stuff. Just let businesses be business, and you will find your society is much better off.
Well, we're going to bring in the people who are listening once they start sending us questions via the Q&A or chat function. But I wondered if you had any view on what's been going on in Ukraine with Russia, this weaponization of food and food supply, whether you just had a view on that, and whether also Russell did.
Well, that always happens in war, and it always has done. One of the in the 18th century, I mean, in Adam Smith's own time, and just afterwards, I mean, particularly just afterwards, you had the Napoleonic wars with France and Britain, and it greatly changed the economic landscape, and that there were things that you simply couldn't do because you couldn't trade efficiently, and the French used to trade with the Americas, and the UK. Great Britain intervened, and that spelt the end of a number of French industries. They had a large cotton industry, for example, but that was really killed off by the embargoes during the Napoleonic Wars. So these things have a prodigious effect, and they do have a prodigious effect, which is very widespread because, as Adam Smith knew, it's a very interconnected world. As I say, with the woolen coat of the workman, the ordinary workman, he says, you can have dye and materials coming from India to the UK, halfway across the world. So it's a very interconnected world. And so when something like that happens and you're making it difficult for people ordinary business people to bring grain in and out of Ukraine, for example, then it has a worldwide effect. And that is a great misfortune. So I wish that we could resolve these things, but from time to time we can't.
Yeah. Russell, any comment on that?
I think what I've witnessed, I work with a couple of Ukrainian tech companies that have come over to the UK under the accelerated visa process. And I think what we're witnessing is this movement of incredible talent out of Ukraine. And I think where we can probably help is, once the fighting does eventually stop, is to help that repatriation back to Ukraine. And how can we use our skills and our capability to ensure that we're open to trade with those individuals? Because it's quite interesting that when I speak to Ukrainian companies, particularly at the start of the war, it wasn't the physical damage of the war that affected their business. It was the large number of customers that cancelled their contracts. So global operations around the world outside Ukraine went, well, there's a war there, so we're going to cancel that order with your company. Whereby I think if we continue trading, that's where we can actually help the people on the ground.
Yeah. There's a question here I just wanted to mention. Someone has written, what would your Adam Smith thoughts be on manufacturing in Scotland to boost our local economy versus elsewhere, purely based on cost? This person says, I'm planning to do both, incidentally.
Well, of course, Adam Smith famously wrote that by means of hotbeds, hot walls, and glass houses, very good grapes could be grown in Scotland, and very good wine could be made of them, but at 30 times the expense of growing it in France. So you do have to be careful about that. And I think Scotland has many advantages going for it. But its maritime nature and its landscape and so on. But you've got to make sure that the business is right for where you're putting it. And it is a big world, and people do move around, and you can put a business almost anywhere. And one of the key things that does affect business location is things like taxation and regulation. That if people look at a country and they say, well, I mean, like looking at the UK now, and they look at corporation tax and they say, if I make a profit, you're going to charge me how much? And I think that absolutely kills the creation of new businesses, because when you start a business, you're taking a risk. You don't know whether your product's going to work or not, your service is going to work or not. You probably are borrowing money from the bank, or you're probably borrowing it from friends and family, or maybe even mortgaging your home. So you're taking a big risk. And then if the government is saying, oh, well, that's nice, take the risk, and if you're successful, we'll charge you a fabulous amount of money in taxation. Well, you think, well, why should I do that? You're just increasing the risk of a new venture. And so there are studies which suggest that taxation is hugely important for people starting new businesses, and it's a huge depressant on new businesses. So I'm very pleased that your questioner is trying to start a new business, and I wish them well. I think they need to look carefully at where they're locating that business, because, as I say, it is a big world, and you can locate anywhere. But yeah, I would certainly like to see more entrepreneurial spirit alive and well in Scotland. I think it could use a good dose of it, quite frankly.
Here's another question for you. Thank you for this conversation. The person says, I live in Texas and witnessed the negative impact of migration. What was Adam Smith's view on immigration? Would he conclude population growth to be a positive on GDP per capita, regardless of how it happens?
I don't think he wrote very much about immigration. He did, of course, talk about movements of people across different countries and how some populations had grown and others shrunk. I think he generally saw that as being the result of economic activity rather than something which led economic activity. That if you lived in a prosperous country, then your population would naturally grow. If you lived in, as it was at the time, a very poor China, then your population would shrink. So I don't know that he wrote very much on that subject. So I don't think I can really quite enlighten your questioner very much about that. It's not something which I think he was terribly concerned about. He wrote about empire and colonialism and things like that, but I think he generally felt that countries should be left alone. And it was a different age, of course, where people could move much more freely than they can move now. You didn't have passports and things like that in many places. In fact, you didn't have passports in many places until really the 20th century. So movement was legally much easier, although logistically it would be very much more expensive, of course, than it is now. So I think part of our issues today is that migration is very much cheaper than it was, and therefore people look around and they say, well, I could easily live somewhere else and I'd be much better off. And of course, they're right. If you want to make a poor person rich, put them in a rich country and they'll become rich.
Russell, your thoughts on that?
Well, one of the major challenges in the UK that we're facing at the present moment is access to talent. And I think that there'd probably be quite a common belief is the fact that we need to attract more talented people to the UK. So I think from that stage, immigration would be a good thing. But I also recognise that we're seeing huge changes in the world, just things like climate change, which is going to result in this migration of people. So I think, if the politicians are looking for subjects to focus on, I would encourage this one rather than perhaps the focus on business and introducing more legislation.
What I would say on this subject is it's got nothing to do with Adam Smith, but it seems to me that if individuals move in dribs and drabs, or one or two at a time, there's no problem at all. I mean, here in Scotland, my wife's family were Italians who came over in the early 20th century. And indeed, the west of Scotland and indeed the east of Scotland are full of Italian Scots. And they came over one at a time. One would come over, and then they would bring family over, and cousins and aunts would say, "Oh yes, let's go and join Luigi in Glasgow," and that you can manage. The problem is when you have things like wars or disasters of one sort and another, which lead to huge numbers of people leaving, or you have the government, which did have restrictions on a particular place, suddenly allows people to travel. I mean, that was the case in Eastern Europe, where millions of Eastern Europeans then suddenly came into the West. And I agree with you. I think that's a good thing. I mean, give people opportunities, but it's the numbers that are the issue, and people find themselves sort of overwhelmed by people who are not quite their culture and so on. But when you look at those things, it's mostly governments that cause these problems. It's governments that tend to spark off wars, not individuals. Individuals don't want wars, and business people in particular don't want wars. Despite all this talk about how business makes money out of war. No, war is extremely damaging for business because the uncertainty of it is incredibly damaging if you're trying to make a business and plan for the future. So governments have a huge responsibility for the problems that we see in immigration, where people are objecting to immigration because of the huge numbers of people that are coming in a very short space of time. And I'm very much in favor of free migration as a principle. The trouble is making it work.
This was an issue in Germany, wasn't it? Angela Merkel was.
Oh, yeah. Yes,
was accused of allowing too many people in, right?
Well, in many places in Western Europe, in the EU, and in Sweden and so on. Yes, absolutely.
Here's a question from Ewan Grant, who says that he thinks our conversation is going very well. He says, where does the Scottish academic community stand on Adam Smith? Well said about the Ukraine, he says, and long links, not least Adam Smith's contemporary, Samuel Gregg.
Well, I think that the academic community are not in favor of Adam Smith or Adam Smith's ideas. That has to be said. It's very interesting when you do surveys of the political leanings of academics, is how many of them are actually on the left of the spectrum. Much more so than the rest of the population. And it's not because academics are intelligent. Other intelligent people split 50-50 left and right. So there's something going on either in the recruitment of academics or whatever. And I'm reminded to take this back to Adam Smith. When Adam Smith won a scholarship to go to Oxford, he went there, and it took him a month on horseback to get there from Scotland. And he went and he discovered that the professors in Oxford got paid whether they taught their students or not. So he said the greater part of the professors have given up, he said, altogether, even the pretense of teaching. And the students would go to a lecture if it was known that if they knew that they would get value from it. But there were precious few lectures around because the teachers couldn't be bothered teaching. So I think academe has a lot to do to tidy up its own profession, quite frankly.
Interesting. Yeah. Russell, your view on the world of academe?
I'm probably not one to comment on that, since my world tends to be much more in the business community.
Yeah. But I would agree that academic institutions, particularly business schools, do have a responsibility to educate and enlighten their students about thinking and how to get on in life as entrepreneurs. Someone wants to know, Eamonn, about the title of your book or books, The Simplification of Adam Smith.
It's called The Condensed Wealth of Nations.
Right.
And the subtitle is The Incredibly Condensed Theory of Moral Sentiments. So there you are. But I've also written a little primer on Adam Smith, which is called Adam Smith, a Primer. And that, again, is available free online from the Institute of Economic Affairs. Yep, that's my contribution to the bibliography. Keep it simple. And no long words, very short. So, and it's translated. Those books are translated into a number of languages. So, if you look out for them, you might be able to find them.
Wonderful, good. Well, as we're approaching the end of this webinar, I want to give each of you a chance to sort of share your closing thoughts. And Russell, if we could start with you, having heard the conversation and spoken with Eamonn as you have, to give your views.
I think I'm really inspired to look more at theory of moral sentiments and some of Adam Smith's thinking on that subject, because I've written down these words: prudence, trust, justice, doing good if you can. And I think those are all things that I see very well reflected amongst these Scots around the world that I work with. You know, there's such a desire from them to contribute, to help, and it's done purely from a philanthropic perspective. So I think I'll have a look at that. So thank you for that, Eamonn. Or at least I'll start with the primer.
Yes, I think that is very important in the Scottish psychology, the Scottish mentality somehow. I don't know why. I just do think that, and I think it's part of the history and culture that it's like any place in the planet which has been largely either an island culture or a very rural culture. You're very accommodating to other people, and you welcome people in, and all of those sorts of things. So it's somehow it's very deep in the psychology. But I would just, my closing thoughts are simply that I think so many people just misinterpret business, and they just think it's everybody out to make a quick buck and, you know, cheat the customer and make as much money as you can. And it isn't about that. It's about developing long-term relationships. And Adam Smith understood that, and that is why his moral thinking, it seems to me, is so important if you're trying to move to an economy which is not based on capital, not based on plant and equipment and heavy machinery and things like that, but is actually based on individuals, based on people's minds, and based on people's thoughts and creativity. And you need to understand how people work. You need to be able to have good relationships of trust, as you say, Russell, with businesses, with colleagues. And I think, therefore, that people should indeed learn a little bit more about ethics in general, and maybe the theory of moral sentiments in particular.
Eamonn, thank you. And Russell, thank you too. I think this has been a hugely interesting and helpful webinar. When people come to listen to the recording, I think they will pick up on these points. Our inner mission at the Age of Scotland Institute is to educate and inspire tomorrow's leaders particularly, and to broaden their understanding of global markets, and within global markets, Pan-Asia, with which, of course, many of their forebears had close connections, as has been said. Next month, on September the 14th, we have Liz Martin from HSBC, their economist for the UK, coming and talking about the challenges that she sees within the UK economy. And then 6 days after that, on September the 20th, we've got a session on artificial intelligence, which we haven't spoken about on this webinar, but which is going to, I think, affect very many of our lives. So those are things that are coming up. And to both of you, an enormous vote of thanks from the Age of Scotland Institute for leading us through this complex, but nevertheless very interesting and very important maze as we work to understand how people who are entrepreneurs can run and build their businesses. So thank you both very much indeed.
Thank you.
And buy the books, incidentally. So there we go.
Or get them free.
Get them free, exactly. Thank you. Thanks so much.